All right, I want to welcome everyone to class. We know today we're going to be getting into Chapter 8 on class and stratification in the United States. All right, so as always, please make sure you guys are focusing and reviewing these objectives. Remember, your exams are based on these objectives. So as long as you cover these objectives when you're reading the chapter, you should do well on the exams and the assignments, because all of the exams and the assignments are focused on these objectives. So please make sure you're covering them. Even the ones that we don't cover on the PowerPoint, or I don't cover on the PowerPoint, it is still your responsibility to do them. All right, now one of the first things that we're going to talk about is what exactly is social inequality. And as our textbook argues, social inequality is a condition in which members of society have different amounts of money, different amounts of power, and different amount of prestige. So for example, we know that one of the, or if not the richest person in this country is, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Bill Gates. And I think the last time I checked, Mr. Gates was worth in excess of 70 billion, and that is with a B, $70 billion. And we know that most Americans have nowhere close to that kind of money. So that is an example of social inequality, where we have different members of society have different amount of money, prestige, and power. And we know that in a capitalistic society, individuals who have money tend to have a lot of power. Now, this country has one of the highest levels, if not the highest levels, of social inequality. And what that simply means is that in this country, the gap between those who are rich versus those who are poor is astronomical. And it is the largest gap, particularly in modern or in most industrial societies currently. So we have a very large gap between those who are rich and versus those who are poor. And this chapter focuses on both of those social groups. Now, stratification, and please make sure you know what social stratification is. As it says here, this is an arrangement of people based on their control of resources. And most of these resources, when we're talking about resources, we're talking about, things that are seen as valuable in a certain society. For example, in our society, money is seen as a valuable resource. So social stratification is based on the arrangement of groups of people based on their control of resources. So for example, in this country, if you have a lot of money, if you have a lot of resources, you are on the top of the social stratification or social hierarchy. If you don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of power, you are on the bottom. Now, we know that different societies stratify people based on different things. Some societies are, people are stratified based on their race, what race they belong to. Other societies, or most societies, are stratified based on money or access or control of money. Some societies base their stratification on what religion you belong to, on what gender you belong to. So, for example, when it comes to gender, in most societies, women are not given the same resources as men. So most societies stratify people also based on gender, including our own. And we're going to talk about this when we get into the chapter on gender. As I said earlier, in this country, stratification in this country is mainly based on money. And in our country, our stratification is basically grouped into three groups: upper, middle, and lower class. So the upper class are the ones who control a lot of resources. The middle class are essentially those in the middle of the upper and the lower, and obviously the lower income groups are the ones who really don't have a lot of resources. Now, we're going to focus on three types of stratification systems, and I think you have an assignment based on this. Three major types of stratification systems that different countries use are slavery, caste, and class. And we're going to focus on each of these types of stratification systems, so please make sure you know them. Now, the first type of stratification system is slavery, and slavery, as it says here, is the most extreme form of stratification Because when we have slaves in society, or when we have individuals who are regarded as slaves, they are owned by other people. Individuals who are defined as slaves don't have any rights. There's little to no social movement when it comes on to individuals who are defined as slaves, and they tend to be very much exploited economically as well as sometimes sexually. And so this is why slavery is defined as the most extreme form of social stratification. Now, we know that slavery still exists, or for those who don't know, slavery actually still exists in a lot of developing as well as industrialized countries, even including our own. We have what are defined now as sex slaves, and we're going to talk about this. Now, we know that this is a historical image of slavery, and I think this is what most people think about when we talk about slaves. Africans from different parts of Africa, coming from that region to what is defined as the New World. And what's interesting also, we did have white slaves. White people were also slaves also, even though we don't talk about that as much. We did have, white people who were defined as slaves also. But this is, like I said, the historical ideas and notions of slave or slavery. What we currently have now are child slaves, where we have in a lot of these poorer developing countries, you have families who literally sell their kids into certain bondage, and the reason why is because of issues of poverty, because these kids work and bring income for the family, and so this is why some of these families would do such a thing, right? Because of the ravages or the issues of poverty. A much more common type of slave in modern time is that of sex slaves. And according to the United Nations, there was a United Nations report that came out several years ago. I think they documented that there were over 20 million sex slaves around this world. And these are women who are basically sold off into brothels and different regions. And if you want to do research on it, it is quite disturbing, to have examples of this. But these are modern types of slaves, and so slavery would be a type of social stratification, and it is one of the most extreme form of social stratification. Now, the other type of social stratification that we're going to talk about, or system of stratification that we're going to talk about, is that of the caste system. And caste system is associated with religion, religious beliefs, right? Where your status or your caste is determined at birth, and your status or your caste is based on, like I said, your religious belief. And the religion that is commonly associated with caste system is that of Hinduism. And what's interesting about the caste system is that the caste that you're born in determines the job that you occupy or that you fulfill in that society. Now, the caste system is defined as a closed system of stratification, meaning that whatever caste you're born in, you remain in that caste for the rest of your life. If you have kids, your kids are going to be in that caste for the rest of their life. And there are different obligations, there's different rules, there are different regulations based on the caste that you're born in. So obviously, if you're a part of a society like this that follows the caste system, you would want to be born into a higher caste because it comes with certain advantages and certain rules and certain obligations and certain jobs. Obviously, if you're born in the lower caste, you're going to be, that's not very good because, like I said, it is a closed system, meaning that you stay in that caste for the rest of your life. Now, there's a lot of, if you actually Google caste system, there's a lot of explanation online that details, some of the history of the caste system. And I would encourage you guys to, learn more about the caste system. You really don't need to know a lot about it for this class, but it's obviously important for you to know just to further your particular knowledge. Now, in this country, we have what is defined as social classes. And your social class is based on ownership and control of resources. And this is what we were talking about earlier, meaning that if you have a lot of resources, you are a part of the upper class. If you have some resource, you are middle class. And basically, if you have no resource or a little bit of resource, then you are a part of the lower class. Now, social classes is what we have in this country. And social classes are defined as an open system of stratification, meaning that a person can be born lower class, born into a lower class family, and through hard work or through entrepreneurship or through education or through just luck, they can go from being a lower class member of society to a middle class or even to an upper class. And one of the examples that we like to point to in this country is that of Oprah Winfrey. For those who don't know the history of Oprah Winfrey, she was actually born into a very poor family. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, she was born in Mississippi to a single mother. And obviously now she was very, very smart. She went to school. She got opportunities to get an education. And as a result, she went into the media business, and now Oprah Winfrey, if I'm not mistaken, is the richest woman in this country. One of the richest, not just black women, one of the richest women. I think Oprah Winfrey is worth, I think, close to $3 billion. So that would be an example of a situation where you can go from being poor to be rich. And so this is why we define social classes as an open system of stratification, which is very different from that of the caste system. So please make sure you know the difference between these different systems of stratification. All right, now let's get into issues of poverty. Now, this is the second half of the chapter. Now, please make sure you are aware of the difference between absolute versus relative poverty. Absolute poverty, as it says here, exists when people don't have, the basic means to secure their life, the basic necessities. So, for example, the basic necessities in life is, particularly in this country, is you want food, you want clothing, and you want shelter. So, for example, somebody who cannot afford to pay for their housing and so they have to live on the street would live in absolute poverty. Somebody who cannot afford their food and so they go hungry every night or on some nights also live in absolute poverty. So, as absolute poverty is when an individual does not have enough money to cover their basic necessities in life. Relative poverty is when somebody is poor, but they're poor compared to someone else within their space or within their community or even within their country. So, for example, a family of four making $40,000 a year would be relatively poor if we compare that family of four to a family of four making 100,000, because we can argue that the family of four making $100,000 could afford a lot more than just basic necessities because they have a lot more resources. So the family of four would be relatively, the family of four making $40,000 a year would be relatively poor compared to the family of four making $100,000, because again, the family of four making $100,000 can afford a lot more than the other family. So relative poverty is when we compare our situation, or what we can afford, to someone else within our society, within our community, and within where we live. And most people compare themselves to other people. So when we talk about poverty, a lot of times we're talking about relative poverty. Now, we know that in this country, poverty is measured by the official poverty line, and there are several assignments that you're going to focus on for this chapter that focuses on the official poverty line. But the official poverty line is based on what the federal government considers to be the minimum amount of money that is required for living in this country, in particular states, and within particular families. Now, the official poverty line is based on the size of your family. So the federal government has actual dollar figures based on a family of one, a family of two, upwards to a family of 8, 9, 10. And so it is the official poverty line. It is the idea that this is the minimum amount of money that you need to have in order to provide for your basic necessity, right? And so the idea here is that, let's say the official poverty line for a family of one, a person living by themselves, is $13,000, hypothetically, right? What the official poverty line says is that if you live by yourself and you make less than what is defined as the minimum, then you are defined as living in poverty. If you make above that amount, you are not defined as living in poverty. So these numbers that the federal government comes up with is very important, and a lot of states use these numbers to determine how much aid is given to individuals and to particular families. So the official poverty line is very important, and it's very important for you to understand what it means and how it relates to issues of poverty in this country. Now, in 2018, and I need to update these numbers, based on the official poverty line, we had around 38 million Americans were defined as living in poverty. And again, so this is how we use the official poverty line to determine how many people in this country live in poverty. And the poverty line, or the numbers of living in poverty, numbers of people who are living in poverty obviously vary. We're now in 2021. At least this PowerPoint was made in 2021. I'm not sure what the poverty line is or the amount of Americans living in poverty currently, but again, you guys can do basic research to figure that one out. All right, now what we're going to talk about here are the social characteristics of poverty in this country. Now, one of the questions I want you to think about is which one of these groups of people constitute the largest number of the poor in this country? The choices you have are Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and white Americans. Now, contrary to popular belief, most poor people in this country are actually white Americans. And in my face-to-face class, we actually, give you, go over the poverty rate in 2018, which is really not that different in 2019 or 2020 or 2021, to show you what these numbers are. And again, you can do your own research, and I think there is assignment that require you to do basic research to find this answer. But again, most poor people in this country, in terms of overall numbers, are actually white Americans. Now, as you can see here, the percentages are different from white Americans. So in 2018, 9.6% of white Americans were living in poverty, compared to 23.5% for Hispanics. But because white Americans make up the majority of the population, their overall numbers is going to be a lot higher. And so this is why their overall numbers are higher than compared to other groups. Now, another interesting characteristics of those who are poor in this country are that of women. We know that women are more likely than men to be poor, and this is referred to as the feminization of poverty. And there are a couple of reasons for the feminization of poverty. And again, the feminization of poverty refers to the fact that women are much more likely than men to live in poverty. And it's not just in this country, it is in most countries. And again, like I said, there are several reasons for this. So let's talk about a couple of these reasons. Now, the first reasons why women are likely to be poor, or more likely to be poor, is because women earn less than men. Even when they do the exact same jobs, women typically earn less than men. And we're going to get more into this when we get into the issues of gender. We also know that divorce is financially much more negative for women than men. And one of the reasons why is because women are the ones who bear the burden and the brunt, the financial burden, a lot of times, of raising kids. And so, when women file for divorce, when women get divorced, they take, their standard of living declines for the most part compared to that of men. And again, as I said before, we know that most women are the ones who are responsible for raising kids. And unfortunately, there's a lot of men who do not fulfill their responsibilities as fathers. And so these are a couple of the reasons why women are much more likely than men to live in poverty. As far as age, we know, unfortunately, that this country has one of the highest rates of children living in poverty. And this is compared to all other industrialized nations. We have the highest rate of childhood poverty. We know that when kids live in poverty, they tend to suffer from a lot of issues, stunted growth. They tend to not do as well in school, and then tend to have a lot of other mental as well as emotional problems. So this is why our high rates of childhood poverty is very problematic, particularly in one of the richest countries on the planet. And by the way, um, this is some figures compared when we compare our childhood poverty to other industrialized nations. We see here that Denmark had one of the lowest rates of childhood poverty, and this, by the way, is in 2016, and these numbers are really not that different in 2021. And our number, as I said earlier, is around 21.7%, and this was in 2016 in terms of our childhood poverty. The first theory is from the conflict perspective. And the conflict perspective basically argues that inequality exists because the resources are divided unequally between the rich versus the poor. And remember, we said here that Karl Marx was one of the proponents of the conflict perspective, and he argued that the fundamental problem with society is that the resources are not divided equally. And so this is why we have class conflict. This is why we have issues of poverty. This is why we have all of these problems, because you have a small group of people owning a lot of stuff and everybody else really don't have a lot. And so this is, from a conflict perspective, this is the fundamental reasons why social inequality exists, because the resources are not divided equally between the haves versus the have-nots. From the functionalist perspective, they argue that actual social inequality, certain levels of social inequality is actually beneficial. It's actually a positive for society. And what they argue here is that when you have poor people, these poor people will be the ones who perform society's dirty work. So poverty is actually beneficial because it serves as a form of motivation for people to seek higher and higher jobs. It also serves as a motivation for people to seek higher and higher education. This is why most of you guys are in college, because you want to have higher paying jobs. And so poverty is beneficial because it gives people motivation, and it's also beneficial because we need people to, perform work that are where they don't get paid a lot, because, those jobs need to be done. And so those jobs are typically performed by people who are poor. And so poverty, certain levels of inequality, is actually beneficial from the functionalist perspective. Now, the functionalist perspective also argues that certain jobs are actually more important than other jobs, and so that's why we need to pay people more. So the functionalists would say that the job of a doctor is actually more important than the job of a cashier. It's actually more important for the society than the job of a cashier. So this is why we should pay doctors more than cashiers. And again, these higher paying jobs serves as motivation. Where people are more motivated to become doctors as opposed to becoming cashiers. So again, from a functionalist perspective, they argue that certain levels of social inequality is actually beneficial for our society. From a symbolic interactionist perspective, and I think this is going to be the last perspective that we focus on, inequality exists because people use money as a symbol of who they are. And so money becomes a very important thing, a very important symbol that we use to define and separate ourselves from people who don't have money. And there's an interesting term, you really don't need to know this for this class, but this is just for information. And it's by Thurston Veblen, conspicuous consumption. And what this means here is that this is when individuals use an item that they buy to define who they are. And they use these items to define and separate themselves from people who don't have money to buy these items. So for example, when an individual buys an expensive purse, for example, Birkin handbags, some of these Birkin handbags are in excess of $100,000. And so when somebody buys a Birkin handbag, they're basically making a statement. They're basically using these items to define who they are. Same thing when a person buys a Lamborghini, a very expensive car. they're using these cars, these symbols, these cars, these things become a symbol of who they are, right? It becomes a way for that person who is driving the car to define themselves. And so money becomes a tool that we use to define and separate ourselves from other people, and becomes a very powerful tool. So this is why, some of us will spend a lot of our time on this planet to accumulate money, to accumulate wealth, because, it becomes a symbol of who we are as an individual. And so this is why these things are important. And I think that is it for our chapter. If you have any questions, please email me and let me know.